He thought he was saving a young girl from a twisted abductor. But what he uncovered in the darkness of a quiet town would unravel a conspiracy far darker, more dangerous, and deeper than he could have ever imagined. A symbol, a missing child, and a girl who wasn't what she seemed. Now, everything he thought he knew is in question. Who is she really? Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting stories like this one. Here, each video is a journey of overcoming an emotion that you won't want to miss. It was past midnight when Officer Marcos Costa pulled into the familiar gas station on the outskirts of Aracoyaba. The small town, nestled far from the bustling city life, usually slept through the night, and so did the gas station, except for the occasional trucker or late-night traveler. The bright lights of the station flickered against the darkness of the road, casting long shadows over the pumps and the convenience store. Marcos had driven this stretch of highway more times than he could count, and yet tonight, something felt different. He parked his patrol car near the pumps and killed the engine, taking a moment to stretch his legs. The rhythmic hum of the station's lights and the distant sound of crickets filled the air, creating an almost eerie calm. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the night in front of him. But it was the trailer on the far side of the pump that caught his eye. At first glance, the trailer looked like any other, weathered, with peeling paint, a couple of rust spots, and a simple design. It was parked at an odd angle, not exactly in line with the other vehicles, but it wasn't completely out of place. What bothered Marcos was the silence surrounding it. The trailer's lights were off, and there was no movement. Nothing at all. Truckers often stopped at this station during their long hauls, but it wasn't common to see a trailer just parked for no reason in the middle of the night. And there was no one around. No truck, no driver. Just the trailer, standing still under the dim glow of the station lights. A slight unease washed over Marcos, but he dismissed it. He had been on the force long enough to know that the quiet moments often carried the most weight. But this felt different. The air was heavy, and something about that trailer made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Shaking off the feeling, he decided to refuel his car and head out as quickly as possible. He wasn't in the mood for any surprises tonight. As he stepped out of the patrol car, his eyes briefly scanned the rest of the station. The attendant behind the counter in the small convenience store glanced at him briefly before returning to whatever he was doing. Marcos grabbed the nozzle, ready to fill up the tank, but just as he did, his eyes drifted back to the trailer. He could see, now that he was closer, that the tires were worn, as though it had been on the road for far too long. And yet, there was something else about it, something unsettling. The way it stood there, isolated from everything else, made him feel as though it was waiting for someone. Or perhaps for something. A light flickered on in the convenience store as the door opened. Marcos stepped toward it, his boots crunching against the gravel. Inside, the store was quiet, with only the dull buzz of the fluorescent lights breaking the silence. The shelves were lined with snacks, drinks, and travel essentials, all untouched. A single customer, a man, was standing near the back, seemingly deep in thought. He was tall, with messy hair and clothes that looked worn from long days of travel. He didn't notice Marcos right away, and when he did, his eyes flickered briefly to meet his. Marcos didn't think much of it at first, but there was something in the man's reaction that caught his attention. The way the man quickly averted his gaze, too quickly, wasn't normal. It was subtle, but for someone who had seen as much as Marcos had, it was a clear sign that something wasn't right. The officer moved toward the counter to buy a bottle of water, pretending not to notice the man's discomfort. But the tension was palpable now. He could feel the man's eyes on him from behind. His pulse quickened just slightly, a reflex from years on the job. It was a small thing, but in his line of work, small things often meant everything. The man shifted nervously, his fingers tapping on the counter. Marcos could hear him breathing slightly faster now, almost as if he was holding his breath. "Everything all right?" Marcos asked, his voice steady but carrying an underlying weight, like he could feel the air around them thickening. The man looked up quickly, his face tight. "Yeah, just tired," he muttered, as if he was trying to convince himself more than anything. Marcos gave a polite nod and turned away, but something didn't sit right. The man's nervousness was too obvious, and it wasn't just about being caught in a small town at night. There was a hidden layer to his unease. Marcos could sense it. As he paid for the water and turned to leave, his eyes drifted back toward the trailer. The figure in the convenience store had faded into the background now, but the trailer remained, a dark silhouette against the night. The unease Marcos felt intensified. There was a feeling gnawing at him, a whisper in the back of his mind that told him to look deeper. He stepped outside, the cool night air hitting his face, and for a moment, he hesitated. The trailer seemed to beckon him. His gut told him something wasn't right, but he wasn't sure what it was yet. "Just a routine stop," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "Focus, Marcos." But the pull of curiosity was stronger than his rational thoughts. He glanced around the empty lot, the distant road stretching out into the darkness. Without thinking too much about it, he walked towards the trailer. The air outside felt still, almost suffocating in its silence. As Officer Marcos Costa approached the trailer, his boots crunched softly against the gravel, the sound oddly loud in the quiet night. The trailer stood there, unmoving, like an abandoned relic, but its presence was anything but passive. It felt wrong, and his instincts were prickling with awareness. He had seen a lot in his career, but something about this scene was different. Marcos hesitated just outside the door of the convenience store. He glanced over at the trailer again. The door was closed, the small window on the side dark. Everything about it screamed, "Stay away," but his curiosity, and his years of experience, drove him forward. It wasn't often that an officer's gut feeling was wrong. He trusted it. Just as he was about to take another step, he caught sight of the man from the store walking toward the trailer. His pace was deliberate, but there was a hurried urgency to it, as if he was trying not to be noticed. The man didn't see Marcos right away, but as he approached the trailer's door, he looked over his shoulder. Their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, the man's face froze, and something flashed behind his eyes, fear, maybe guilt. The brief moment of hesitation was enough for Marcos to notice. It wasn't just paranoia or a bad vibe anymore. Something was off about this entire situation. The man quickly turned back to the trailer and knocked on the door, a sharp rap that sounded louder than necessary. Marcos, still standing at the edge of the lot, narrowed his eyes, watching closely. The door of the trailer opened a crack, and the officer could see just a sliver of a face on the other side. There was a brief exchange, too quiet for Marcos to hear, but the man's nervous gestures were clear. After a few seconds, the door shut, and the man stepped inside. Marcos felt a tightening in his chest. He couldn't explain why, but something in his bones told him to approach. There was no immediate danger, at least, not that he could see, but his intuition was stronger than his desire for caution. He took a few slow steps toward the trailer, each footfall echoing in the stillness. His hand instinctively went to the radio on his belt, ready to call for backup if necessary. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the man's behavior was too strange to ignore. Just as he reached the side of the trailer, he hesitated again, his hand hovering over the door. The vehicle was dark, still, and he couldn't hear a sound from inside. His breath felt heavier now, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The trailer was older, the kind often used for long-haul transport, but the fact that it was parked here in the middle of nowhere at this hour, with the odd behavior of the man inside, made his gut churn. Marcos glanced back toward the convenience store. The man had disappeared, but the attendant was still behind the counter, not paying attention to what was happening outside. It seemed like no one else had noticed the strange behavior. He turned back to the trailer. His fingers gripped the cold metal handle of the door. He could feel the vibrations of his pulse in his fingertips. What the hell could be going on in there? With a deep breath, Marcos gave a sharp knock on the door, louder than the man had earlier. His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the authority in it when he spoke. "Police. Open up." Silence. For a moment, Marcos thought he might be wasting his time. But then he heard it, a faint shuffle of movement inside, like someone was rushing to hide something. The door cracked open slowly, just enough to reveal the man's face again. This time, his eyes were wide, and his expression was almost panicked. "What do you want?" the man asked, his voice strained. He was trying to sound calm, but it wasn't working. Marcos could hear the tremble underneath his words. "I'm just checking on the situation," Marcos said, keeping his voice even but firm. "This trailer is out of place. You're parked here at an unusual hour. What's going on?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes flickered nervously over Marcos's shoulder, as though he were debating whether to run or shut the door on him. But after a tense beat, he took a deep breath and leaned out slightly, lowering his voice. "You're right, it's late," he said, trying to sound casual, but failing miserably. "I've just been traveling. I needed a place to rest." Marcos didn't buy it. His instincts screamed that something was wrong, and the man's nervous energy confirmed it. The officer took a step forward, his hand inching toward his holster. "I'm going to need you to step outside, sir," Marcos said, his voice more commanding now. "I'm conducting a quick check of your trailer." The man's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Marcos thought he was going to make a break for it. But instead, he froze, his hands twitching at his sides. "No. No need for that. Everything's fine here." Marcos's gaze hardened, but his voice remained calm, though now with an edge. "Step outside, now." For the first time, the man's facade slipped. His eyes darted to the side again, and then he looked back at Marcos, his hands trembling. Marcos saw something else, something real, in his eyes now. A deep, primal fear. Without warning, the door swung open wide. The man backed up quickly, almost stumbling as he did, as if he were preparing to flee. Marcos stepped into the trailer's cramped space without hesitation, his hand on the weapon at his side. And then he saw it. There, in the far corner of the trailer, huddled against the wall, was a young girl, her wrists shackled with chains, her face pale and covered in dirt. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she didn't make a sound. Marcos's blood ran cold. He took one long look at the girl, his heart hammering in his chest. Then he reached for his radio. "Officer down. I need backup immediately," he said, his voice firm despite the shock. "We've got a kidnapping situation here." The radio crackled in Marcos's ear as he made the call, but the words barely registered in his mind. His eyes remained fixed on the girl, her small frame trembling in the corner of the trailer, chained like an animal. The stillness of the moment was suffocating, every breath feeling heavy and thick, as if the air had turned to lead. The man, who had been so eager to avoid Marcos's gaze just moments ago, stood frozen, his hands still trembling at his sides. His earlier bravado was gone now, replaced with something far worse, panic. His face, once covered with a veneer of calm, was now a mask of desperation. "Please, don't do this," the man whispered hoarsely, his voice quivering. She's not what you think." Marcos's gaze never wavered from the girl. He could see that she was no more than 10 or 11 years old, her face streaked with grime, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and exhaustion. The chain around her wrists was too tight, digging into her skin. It looked like she hadn't been outside, let alone seen sunlight, in days. He took a slow step toward her, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm, but not pulling it out. He had to stay focused. There was a life in front of him that needed saving. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice sharp, then turned to the man. "What have you done to her?" The man took a step back, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For a moment, he seemed to be struggling with his words, as if deciding whether to lie or tell the truth. She's not mine," he finally spat out. She's. I was trying to help her. I'm trying to help her." Marcos raised an eyebrow. The man's words were incomprehensible, and his nervous stuttering only fueled the officer's suspicion. "Help her?" Marcos repeated, his voice icy. He took another step forward, his eyes narrowing as he kept his focus on the man. "How do you help someone by chaining them up in a trailer?" The man flinched, and for a moment, Marcos thought he might break down right then and there. His eyes darted to the girl, who hadn't made a sound. She was still huddled against the wall, her eyes fixed on the floor, her body trembling as though she might disappear into the very wood of the trailer. "Please, don't take her away," the man pleaded, his voice cracking. She's in danger. You don't understand. I was just trying to keep her safe." The desperation in his voice was almost convincing, but Marcos knew better than to fall for such manipulation. He had seen it all in his years as a cop. People could say anything to cover their tracks, to avoid responsibility for their actions. But the girl's presence, her obvious distress, spoke volumes. This wasn't a situation where anyone was being helped. Marcos took another step forward, closer to the girl now, but still keeping his eyes trained on the man. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "What's her name?" The man stammered, his eyes shifting between Marcos and the girl. He opened his mouth as though he were about to say something, but no words came out. Marcos's patience was wearing thin. "Who is she?" he repeated, his tone growing sharper. Finally, the man broke. She's my niece, okay?" he blurted out. Her parents died in a car crash a few months ago. I took her in, but she was too much. She wouldn't listen. She ran away, tried to get away from me, so I had to. keep her here to protect her." Marcos's eyes never left the girl as the man's words tumbled out. The story was falling apart with every sentence. He could see the cracks in the man's fabricated story, his inconsistencies, his panic, the way he tried to justify the unforgivable. "Protect her?" Marcos repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. "You're keeping her chained up in a trailer, for her protection? What kind of sick joke is that?" The man started shaking his head violently. "I didn't hurt her. I swear. I didn't hurt her. She was just difficult. I was trying to do the right thing. She kept running away, and I couldn't let her go. She was too young. She didn't understand. Shut up," Marcos cut him off, his voice harsh now. He didn't want to hear another word. He had heard enough lies. It was all becoming clearer. The man had no intention of protecting the girl. He had locked her away like a prisoner, perhaps out of fear of losing control. Marcos was disgusted by the thought. He turned back to the girl, kneeling down to her level, trying his best to look reassuring. His heart broke as he saw how she flinched at his approach, as though she feared that even the smallest gesture might cause her harm. "It's okay," Marcos said gently, keeping his voice soft. "You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." The girl didn't respond, but she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. It was clear she had been through something unimaginable, and even though Marcos's words were meant to comfort her, she seemed unsure if she could trust anyone at all. As he reached for the chains around her wrists, the man behind him started to panic. "No. You can't, she can't go anywhere." His voice broke as he lunged forward, but Marcos was quicker. He grabbed the man by the collar, shoving him back. "You stay where you are," Marcos warned, his voice low but filled with authority. With a few swift movements, Marcos unchained the girl, and she winced at the release, as though the sudden freedom was almost as painful as the chains had been. She rubbed her wrists, tears silently spilling down her cheeks. Marcos didn't have time to comfort her just yet. He called for backup again, his mind already racing with the next steps. This was going to be a big case, and the girl needed immediate care. The man's story had already fallen apart, and Marcos knew that he would be in custody for a long time. As the radio crackled in his ear with the promise of reinforcements, Marcos stood up and helped the girl to her feet. She didn't resist, but she still looked so lost, so fragile. "Don't worry. You're not alone anymore," Marcos reassured her, leading her toward the door. But before they could reach the exit, the girl suddenly stopped. She turned back, her wide eyes locked on the man still standing in the trailer. Marcos followed her gaze and saw the man, now slumped against the wall, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His eyes were frantic, wild. "You don't understand. She's dangerous," the man hissed, his voice a mix of anger and fear. "She's not who you think she is. You don't know what she's capable of." The warning hung in the air like a curse, but Marcos didn't flinch. The girl's past was still a mystery, but whatever it wasn't her fault. And he wasn't about to let anyone harm her again. The moment the man spoke those words, a cold chill crept down Marcos's spine. The girl wasn't just a victim, according to the man, she was something else, something dangerous. The officer's instincts flared, but he refused to let doubt cloud his judgment. Still, there was a nagging sense in the back of his mind. What was the man trying to say? Dangerous? Marcos asked, keeping his voice steady, though inside, his mind was racing. He stepped closer to the girl, who was now staring at the man with an unreadable expression. The man, still slumped against the wall, was muttering to himself, his hands trembling. His wild eyes never left the girl. "You have no idea what she's capable of," he repeated, almost like a chant. "You don't know what she's done." Marcos shook his head, narrowing his gaze. It was clear that the man was unraveling, perhaps out of guilt or fear of what would happen when the authorities arrived. His ranting didn't matter now, what mattered was getting the girl to safety. But as Marcos took a final look at the man, something in the air shifted. He could feel it, a presence, a change in the atmosphere. He glanced at the girl again, and in that moment, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Her expression had changed. Her wide, fearful eyes were gone. Instead, she had an almost knowing look. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. A wave of unease washed over Marcos. He didn't know what to make of it, but it felt like a signal. Something was happening beneath the surface. "Come on," Marcos said softly, taking a step toward her, his voice gentle. He held out his hand. "Let's get you out of here. You're safe now. We'll figure everything out." But the girl didn't move. She was still frozen, staring at the man. Marcos noticed her eyes flicker to the corner of the trailer, where a large, black duffel bag sat in the shadows. It was unremarkable at first glance, but something about it caught his attention. The girl's gaze lingered there for a moment too long. Marcos frowned, a suspicion rising within him. "Do you want to leave?" he asked, his voice low, but firm. His hand was still extended toward her, but she didn't respond. Instead, her gaze shifted back to the man. The man had gone quiet now, his eyes darting between Marcos and the girl. He seemed to be holding his breath, waiting for something. It was then that Marcos heard a soft noise, like a faint tapping. He looked around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The tapping grew louder, almost rhythmic. The girl's eyes widened, her pupils dilating as she stared at the duffel bag in the corner. Get away from her, the man suddenly growled, his voice low and harsh. He surged to his feet, his hands still shackled behind him. She's not what you think. She's... But Marcos didn't have time to hear another word. He was already moving, his feet taking him toward the duffel bag, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached it, he didn't even hesitate. He grabbed the bag and yanked it open, his mind already calculating the possible contents: drugs, weapons, something worse. But what he found inside made his stomach lurch. Inside the duffel bag, there were papers, old, yellowing papers that looked like medical records. And beneath them, a series of photographs, hastily stacked, with faces of children in various states of distress. Some were smiling, others appeared confused, and a few were marked with something that looked like a red pen. Marcos's breath caught in his throat as he flipped through the photographs. One of the children looked familiar. It was a girl, young, with dark hair and a sad expression. She looked almost like the girl in the trailer, but it couldn't be her, could it? He paused, his eyes glued to the picture. In the background, he noticed something strange, an unmistakable symbol, drawn on a wall. It was subtle, but it was there, a dark symbol, almost like a warning. Who are you? Marcos whispered to himself, but it wasn't directed at the man in front of him. It was directed at the girl. She had not moved from her spot, but her eyes were still locked on the bag. She looked expectant. It was as if she knew what he would find. The tapping noise grew louder. Marcos's hand shook as he flipped through more photos, each one more disturbing than the last. The symbol in the background was appearing more frequently. And then, in the last photograph, his worst fear was confirmed. The symbol was on the wall behind a smiling girl, her face lit up with joy. But the girl wasn't just smiling. In the photo, she was standing next to another child, a boy, who looked strangely familiar. Marcos's heart raced. The boy in the photograph was no longer a mystery. It was a face he knew all too well, another child from his own precinct, someone who had gone missing just months ago. The case had been closed as an accidental death. But now, Marcos wasn't so sure. His gaze shot back to the girl. She was still staring at him, her face unreadable. Was she connected to all of this? The missing children, the photographs, the symbol? Why didn't you tell me? Marcos asked her quietly, his voice shaking. The girl looked at him for a moment, and then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Before he could process what was happening, the sound of sirens filled the air. Backup was arriving. But something about the scene felt different now. The girl had known about the photographs, known about the secrets hidden in the duffel bag. And as Marcos stood there, staring at her, the weight of the moment pressed down on him like a suffocating force. Everything he thought he knew was unraveling. The man who had claimed to be protecting her had clearly been lying. But the girl, who was she really? And what had she been through? As the sound of the approaching sirens grew louder, Marcos knew one thing for certain: this case was far from over. The truth was darker, more twisted than he could have ever imagined. And the girl, the one he had thought was the victim, was at the heart of it all. The sound of sirens grew louder, closer, but Marcos stood frozen, still holding the photographs in his hand. His mind raced, spinning with the revelations that had unfolded in the past few minutes. The girl, the photographs, the symbol, it all pointed to something far more sinister than he could have imagined. And yet, despite everything, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He couldn't walk away from this. Not now. He glanced at the girl. Her eyes were wide, but her face was still unreadable. She hadn't moved, and in that silence, Marcos felt the creeping realization that he didn't know her at all. She had played him. She had known more about this than he ever would. "Who are you?" he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. He wasn't sure if he was asking her or himself. The girl's gaze flickered down to the photographs in his hand. Without a word, she stepped toward him, her bare feet making no sound on the cold metal floor of the trailer. The silence was suffocating. As she reached for the photos, Marcos instinctively pulled them away, but she gave him a look that sent a cold shiver through his spine. There was something about her, something he couldn't place, that felt wrong. She reached out again, and this time, he let her take the photographs. She looked down at them briefly, her fingers brushing over the faces of the children, before her eyes returned to Marcos's. There was a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. "You don't understand," she said softly, her voice so quiet that he almost didn't hear it over the sirens. Marcos's heart skipped a beat. There was something so detached, so cold in her voice, it sent a ripple of discomfort through him. He had heard criminals confess in similar tones, detached, unbothered by their own actions. "What don't I understand?" he asked, his voice taut. "What's going on here?" The girl's expression didn't change. She looked down at the duffel bag again, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than it should have. Marcos couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something that she wasn't telling him. "You think you know what's happening, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think he's the bad guy, don't you?" Marcos's stomach twisted. Was she talking about the man who had locked her away? The one who had claimed to be her protector? Or was there more to this story than he had realized? The girl didn't wait for an answer. She moved her gaze back to the photographs. Her fingers traced the image of the boy, the missing child. His face stared back at her, frozen in time. She looked at him for several seconds, almost lovingly. "I know him," she said quietly, almost to herself. "He was the first." Marcos's breath caught in his throat. "The first? The first what?" He could barely comprehend the gravity of her words. She didn't seem scared. She wasn't a victim. Not in the way he had believed. "You're not a victim, are you?" he asked, his voice low, his heart pounding as the pieces began to click together. The girl's expression softened just a fraction. A flicker of something, regret? Guilt, flashed across her face, but it was gone almost instantly. "No," she said. "But I wasn't always like this." Before Marcos could respond, the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside broke the tension. The backup had arrived. He could hear the distinct sounds of several vehicles pulling into the gas station parking lot, doors slamming, voices shouting as the officers rushed to secure the area. But Marcos couldn't take his eyes off the girl. She was still standing there, her body now in a more relaxed posture, as if she had already accepted whatever was coming. Her hand rested lightly on the duffel bag, her fingers curled around the edge as if it were a part of her. The sirens outside grew louder, and the girl's gaze shifted, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. Her eyes flickered back to the photographs for a moment before she looked up at Marcos once more. "They'll never believe you," she said, her tone distant but certain. "Not when they find out." "Find out what?" Marcos asked, his chest tightening as his instincts screamed that he was on the verge of a much larger and more dangerous discovery. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, the door to the trailer flew open with a force that startled both of them. Several officers, guns drawn, flooded the doorway. One of them, Officer Rios, stepped forward. "Marcos. You okay?" Rios's voice was laced with concern, but his eyes flickered quickly from the girl to the man chained up in the corner. Marcos didn't answer right away. His mind was spinning, still trying to make sense of everything. The girl, the photographs, the cryptic warning. "I'm fine," he said finally, his voice measured. "Get him out of here." Two officers moved toward the man, pulling him roughly to his feet and shackling his wrists. Marcos couldn't help but glance at the girl one last time. She hadn't moved. She was staring directly at him, her eyes locked onto his, as if she were waiting for something. "Marcos," Rios called again, snapping him out of his daze. "We need to get her to the station for questioning. We'll get her checked out, make sure she's okay." Marcos nodded, but the unease hadn't left him. The girl hadn't shown a single sign of fear, not even when the officers stormed in. She was different. He didn't know how, but he could feel it in the way she carried herself. She wasn't just another victim of a twisted abductor. She was something else entirely. As the officers started to escort the man out of the trailer, Marcos hesitated, watching the girl one last time. He had no idea who she was, or what she had been through, but the one thing he knew for certain was that this case wasn't over. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. The girl's gaze shifted again, and for a fleeting moment, she looked almost pitying. "You're just like them," she whispered. Marcos's blood ran cold as he realized the truth in her words. She wasn't scared of him. She wasn't scared of anyone. And as the officers led the man away and the girl turned to follow, Marcos couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered the tip of an iceberg. A much darker, far-reaching conspiracy. The doors of the trailer slammed shut behind them, and as the officers led the man away in cuffs, the air seemed to shift. Marcos stood motionless for a moment, watching them drive off, his thoughts a jumbled mess of confusion and suspicion. He had come to this station expecting a straightforward bust, but nothing about this case had been straightforward since he first laid eyes on that trailer. The girl, the one he had thought was a helpless victim, was now an enigma. Her calm demeanor, her cryptic words, and that unsettling look in her eyes, they didn't match anything he'd seen in a typical case. But the feeling in his gut kept growing, tightening with each passing second. As backup officers began securing the scene, Rios approached him, her expression serious. She had seen it all, but even her hardened exterior couldn't mask the concern that flickered in her eyes. "Marcos," she said quietly, her voice low. "Are you sure she's okay? We need to get her checked out. You saw the condition she was in. She's been locked up in there for God knows how long." Marcos took a deep breath and shook his head. "I don't know, Rios. I'm starting to think we're not dealing with what we thought we were." Rios frowned, following his gaze as he looked back toward the trailer. "What do you mean?" "There's something about her," Marcos trailed off, his voice trailing into the growing silence. "The way she acted, the way she looked at me. It was like she knew more than she was letting on." Rios raised an eyebrow. "You're saying she's involved in this?" "I don't know," Marcos muttered. "But I don't trust her. Something doesn't sit right. And what the hell was that about the photographs and the symbol?" Rios glanced at the girl, who was being escorted by another officer toward the patrol car. She had her arms crossed, her gaze distant, as if she were miles away from everything happening around her. Her expression was calm, but her eyes? They were anything but. They were too knowing, too calm in the face of all that had happened. Marcos ran a hand through his hair in frustration. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had thought that by arresting the man, he would have solved the case. But now, he realized, it had only just begun. "I want to know who she really is," Marcos said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "And I'm going to find out." Rios nodded, still skeptical. "You think she's connected to the missing kids?" "I don't know. But those photographs. That symbol. The boy in the picture," Marcos trailed off, his thoughts drifting back to that haunting image of the missing child, the one he'd recognized. "I'll run a check on her," Rios offered. "But you know how it goes. We'll have to wait until we can get her to the station and start questioning her." Marcos nodded, but his mind was already racing. He couldn't wait. He needed answers now. He needed to understand why the girl was so calm. Why she hadn't been afraid. Why she hadn't tried to escape when the officers arrived. He turned his attention back to the girl, who was now sitting in the back of the patrol car, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't crying, she wasn't asking for help, she wasn't anything like the frightened, traumatized child he had expected to find. "Hey," he called to one of the officers near the car. "Get her a blanket or something. Make sure she's comfortable." The officer nodded and stepped inside the car to retrieve a blanket. Marcos watched the girl carefully, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of her. She looked back at him once, and this time, their gaze locked for a long, unsettling moment. Her eyes were almost unnerving, calm, unreadable, as if she were watching him, studying him. "Why don't you say anything?" Marcos muttered to himself, just loud enough for Rios to hear. "She's been through a lot, Marcos." "Maybe she's just in shock," Rios said softly, trying to reassure him. But Marcos wasn't convinced. There was something deeper at play here, something that didn't add up. As the officers began preparing to transport the girl to the station, Marcos made a decision. He had to find out more, and he had to do it now. He couldn't afford to wait for the standard procedure to run its course. The girl's silence, her strange demeanor, and the eerie symbolism tied to the case, all of it pointed to a conspiracy that was bigger than he could have imagined. "I'm going to follow the man," Marcos said, suddenly determined. "I need to talk to him. He's the key to all of this." Rios looked at him, concern flashing in her eyes. "You sure that's a good idea? We don't know what we're dealing with yet. The guy's clearly dangerous." "I know," Marcos said, his jaw tight. "But if we wait too long, we might lose our chance to understand the full picture. I've got a feeling he's more involved in this than he's letting on." With that, he turned and walked away, heading toward his patrol car. Rios hesitated for a moment, then followed him, a reluctant partner in the investigation. The drive to the holding facility was brief, but the entire time, Marcos's mind churned with questions. The man they had arrested was being processed at the local holding facility, but something in his gut told him there was more to this case than just a twisted abduction. The girl, the way she had spoken, the way she had known things, there was something about her that kept nagging at him. "Marcos, we have to be careful," Rios said, breaking the silence as they drove. "The guy you're after, he's already dangerous. You don't know what he might be involved in. And if you're right about the girl, you could be walking into something way over your head." Marcos glanced at her, his expression hard. "We can't afford to ignore this. Not now. Something's off, and I need to know the truth." When they arrived at the facility, they were met by the prison warden, a gruff man named Wally. He led them down a cold hallway, past rows of locked cells. The man they had arrested earlier was sitting alone in a cell, his hands shackled to the bars. He looked up as they entered, his face drawn and pale from the ordeal. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, defiance. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice hoarse. "You don't know what she is." Marcos ignored him and stepped closer to the bars. "I know you're lying. And I'm going to find out what you were really doing with that girl." The man's eyes widened, his lips trembling. "You don't understand," he whispered, almost pleading. "She's dangerous. She's not what you think she is." Marcos stared at him, unwavering. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And when I do, you'll be the one who's in trouble." The cell felt colder than it should have, even with the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly. Marcos stood just a few feet away from the man in shackles, his posture rigid, as though the weight of the situation was pressing down on him from all sides. The man's fearful gaze locked onto his, and for the first time, Marcos felt a shift in the air, a palpable tension that settled like a fog between them. "You need to tell me everything," Marcos demanded, his voice low but firm. "I know you're not the only one involved in this. You have answers, and I'm going to get them from you." The man's lips quivered, and he looked away, his eyes darting to the corner of the small cell, as if searching for an escape. But there was no escape now. His fate had already been sealed when they'd found the girl in that trailer. "You don't understand," the man whispered again, his voice desperate. "She's not a victim. She's part of something much bigger than you can imagine." Marcos's stomach churned. The girl, he had suspected as much. She wasn't just a helpless child caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was more. He had seen it in her eyes, the way she had looked at him, the way she had known things. "What do you mean?" Marcos pressed, his eyes narrowing. "What's she involved in?" The man flinched, his hands trembling as he gripped the bars. "You'll never get her to talk. She's been conditioned. She's been raised for this, for them. You think I'm the one pulling the strings? No. I'm just a pawn. She's the one you should be worried about." Marcos's mind raced. The girl, conditioned. Raised for something, someone. The pieces were starting to come together, but he didn't have enough information to make sense of it all. He stepped closer to the bars, his tone becoming more insistent. "Who are they? Who's behind this?" The man recoiled, his body shrinking back as though the question itself scared him more than the handcuffs. "You're too late," he said softly, shaking his head. "You think you can save her, but it's already too late. They've been training her for years. She's one of them now." Marcos's blood ran cold. Training her? He had seen this before: cults, underground organizations, people brainwashed into following a cause. But this felt different. He had a horrible feeling that what was happening here wasn't just a case of kidnapping. It was much darker, much more twisted. He stood there for a moment, the silence between them heavy, as his thoughts swirled like a storm in his mind. But then the door to the holding area opened behind him, and Officer Rios stepped in, her expression serious. "We've got her back at the station," Rios said, her voice tight with concern. "The doctors cleared her, but she's still not saying anything. Well, you've got to see it for yourself. She's not like other kids we've dealt with." Marcos's heart raced. He didn't need to hear any more. The urgency in Rios's voice told him that they had to act quickly. "Is she still in the interview room?" Marcos asked, his mind already shifting into investigative mode. Rios nodded. "Yeah. We've been trying to get something out of her, but she's just staring at the walls. It's like she's somewhere else. And when she does speak, it's like she's reciting lines. I don't know if she's telling the truth or if it's something she's been told to say." Marcos exchanged a brief, knowing look with Rios before turning back to the man in the cell. "I'll deal with you later. Don't go anywhere." The man let out a low, bitter laugh, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "You think you're going to get answers? It's already too late. She's one of them now. You'll see soon enough." Marcos didn't respond. He knew the man wasn't going to say anything more useful, and he didn't have time to waste. The interview room at the station was dimly lit, with only a single overhead light casting long shadows on the walls. The girl was sitting in one of the chairs, her hands folded in her lap, her posture unnaturally still. Her gaze was fixed on the wall in front of her, her face expressionless. Marcos hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, Rios following closely behind. The door clicked shut behind them, and for a moment, the room felt even more suffocating than before. "Hey there," Marcos said, keeping his voice calm, trying to establish a connection. "We need to talk. I know you're scared, but we're trying to help you." The girl didn't respond. Her eyes didn't even flicker toward him. Marcos leaned against the table, his gaze scanning her face. There was something deeply unsettling about the way she sat there, so still, so detached. It wasn't the way a normal child would react after going through something traumatic. There was no sign of fear, no desperation. Just silence. He cleared his throat and sat down across from her, maintaining a calm but assertive posture. I know you've been through a lot. You don't have to be scared anymore. We're here to help you. She didn't speak. But her eyes, those eyes, shifted slowly toward him. She met his gaze for the first time, and for a moment, Marcos felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. There was something in her expression, something empty, that made his blood run cold. I'm not scared, the girl said suddenly, her voice soft but eerily calm. I'm not like them. Marcos's heart skipped a beat. Who are you talking about? The girl's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. The ones who think they control me. They don't. Not anymore. Marcos felt his stomach drop. There was no fear in her voice, no sign of a child desperate for rescue. It was as if she knew exactly what was happening, and she was beyond it. Beyond everything. You don't understand, she continued, her voice almost sing-song now, as though she were reciting something learned by rote. I'm not the victim. I'm the one who controls. Marcos sat up straighter, his mind reeling. This wasn't a scared child. This wasn't a girl who needed saving. This was something else entirely. What are you talking about? Marcos asked, his voice tight with tension. What are you really involved in? The girl looked at him, her gaze piercing, almost calculating. I've been trained for this, she whispered. I'm part of something much bigger than you'll ever understand. Marcos leaned forward, his heart racing. Who's behind this? Who trained you? The girl tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his. I told you, they. Who are they? Marcos demanded, now desperate for answers. But the girl didn't respond. She simply smiled again, a chilling smile that seemed to send a ripple of unease through the room. The truth is out there, she said cryptically. But it's too late for you. You'll see soon enough. Before Marcos could press further, the door to the room opened suddenly, and one of the officers stepped in, his face pale. Marcos, you need to see this. Now. Marcos's pulse quickened as he stood up. What is it? The officer hesitated before answering, his voice low. The man, the one we arrested, he's dead. The words hung in the air like a lead weight. Marcos stood frozen in the interview room, his mind racing as the officer's words echoed in his ears. The man, the one we arrested, he's dead. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. His heart skipped a beat, and a cold rush of adrenaline shot through his veins. Dead? How could he be dead? He turned toward the officer, his expression hard. What happened? The officer looked uneasy, glancing at the girl in the corner of the room before answering. He was found in his cell. We don't know how, but he's gone. No signs of forced entry, no visible injuries. Just, dead. Marcos's stomach tightened. The man had been arrested, processed, and locked up only a few hours ago. There should have been no way for him to get out, no reason for him to end up like this. The only conclusion Marcos could draw was one that chilled him to his core. Someone, or something, was pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Take me to him, Marcos said, his voice firm but shaken. The officer nodded and led the way, while Rio stayed behind in the interview room, her eyes locked on the girl. As Marcos walked down the sterile, brightly lit hallway of the station, his thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and dread. The girl's words kept repeating in his mind, I'm not the victim. I'm the one who controls. When they reached the holding area, the warden met them at the door. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. We found him less than an hour ago, he said, voice strained. He was sitting on the cot, just, lifeless. No signs of struggle. No signs of anything. Just, dead. Marcos took a deep breath and nodded. He needed to see it for himself. Inside the small, dimly lit cell, the man was slumped over in a chair, his head hanging low. At first glance, he looked like he was sleeping, but there was no mistaking the unnatural stillness in his posture. No breath. No movement. Just cold. Markos stepped closer, studying the body. There were no visible wounds, no bruising, no blood. It was as if he had simply stopped existing. But there was one thing that sent a shiver down Markos's spine. On the wall, just above the cot, was a symbol. The same symbol that had appeared in the photographs of the missing children. The same symbol that had been etched onto the wall of that hidden room where the girl had been kept. It was drawn in a deep red, as if painted with blood. And beneath it, there was a single word, scratched into the wall with frantic desperation. Too late. Markos felt a wave of nausea wash over him. His head spun as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The symbol, the photographs, the cryptic words, the girl wasn't just a victim of some twisted kidnapping ring. She was part of something much darker. A cult? An organization? Whatever it was clear now that they had their hands in every corner of this case. And they were far more powerful than he could have ever imagined. "We need to get her out of here," Markos muttered under his breath. He turned to the warden. "Call for backup. Get a team in place. We need to bring her in." When they returned to the interview room, Rios was standing with her arms crossed, watching the girl closely. She hadn't moved since Markos had left, her eyes still vacant, distant, like she was somewhere far away. "She hasn't said a word since you left," Rios said, her voice tight with frustration. "She's just staring at the wall. I don't know what to make of it, Markos. There's something about her." Markos nodded, his gaze fixed on the girl. Something was off. More off than he had realized. As he stepped closer to her, the girl finally spoke, her voice soft, almost unrecognizable. "They'll come for me soon," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "You can't stop them. You can't stop what's coming." Markos's heart skipped a beat. What's coming? He had heard that phrase before, but this time, it felt more urgent, more dangerous. The girl slowly looked up at him, her eyes still empty, but there was a new depth to them now. She wasn't just staring at him anymore. She was seeing him. And the way she looked at him, it was like she knew exactly what was going to happen next. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said, her voice becoming more confident. "The man you arrested wasn't the one behind this. He was just a tool. They've been watching me for a long time. Watching all of us. You think you're in control, but you're not. You're too late." Markos felt his blood run cold. Too late. The same words that had been written on the wall in the holding cell. The girl wasn't just a pawn. She wasn't even a victim. She had been part of this all along. But what was her role? What was she being trained for? "Who are they?" Markos asked again, his voice sharp with urgency. The girl didn't answer immediately. She seemed to think for a moment, her eyes flicking to the door, then back to him. "They're everywhere," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And they've been waiting for this moment. I'm not the last. I'm the beginning." A heavy silence fell over the room. Markos's mind reeled. This wasn't just a case of missing children. It wasn't just about one abduction. This was something much bigger, something that reached far beyond this small town, beyond anything he could have imagined. And the girl, she was at the center of it all. He stood there, staring at her, as the weight of her words settled over him. He had thought this was a rescue mission. He had thought he was saving a child from a twisted captor. But in reality, she wasn't just the victim, she was the key. And whatever this was, whatever she had been a part of, was far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. Marcos turned to Rios, his expression grim. We need to get her into protective custody. We need to find out who they are. Before it's too late. But even as he spoke the words, he knew the truth, it might already be too late. If you liked this story and want more content like this, leave a like, share it with someone you know will be moved by it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore inspiring stories and moments that touch the heart. Until the next video.